He stood in his front yard in a faded t-shirt, holding a garden hose, watching the water arc over his tomato plants. To every neighbor on Birchwood Lane, Grant Holloway was just a quiet, single dad, a little reserved, always polite, never causing trouble. Nobody knew what he'd done for 14 years. Nobody knew what he was capable of. But the 19-year-old in fighting gloves standing 20 feet away was about to find out the hard way. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is the kind that makes you forget to breathe. Stay until the very end, because every single part of this builds into something you will not see coming. And while you're at it, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The moving truck came on a Tuesday morning in late April, which was the first sign that the Holloway family's luck was about to turn. Not because Tuesdays are unlucky, but because Grant had made it through an entire Pennsylvania winter without a single problem, which, after 14 years of operating in places where problems had a way of getting people killed, felt almost suspicious. Peaceful in a way he didn't entirely trust. Like the stillness before a patrol goes wrong. He'd been watching the Mercer house from his kitchen window while he drank his coffee. The Mercers, an elderly couple who kept a bird bath in the front yard and waved at everyone, had sold and moved to Florida in February. Since then, the house had sat dark and quiet, which Grant genuinely appreciated. He liked quiet. He had worked very hard to build a life where quiet was possible. "Who's moving in?" Sophie asked without looking up from her phone. She was at the kitchen table, 16 years old, dark-haired like her mother had been, eating toast with the particular focused efficiency of someone who was simultaneously doing 3 other things. "Don't know yet. Could be nice people." Could be. He didn't say what he was actually thinking, which was that he'd learned not to assume. Most people were fine. Some weren't, and the ones who weren't rarely announced themselves. He watched 2 men carry an enormous flat-screen television through the front door, then a sectional couch that took 4 men and a lot of swearing, then what appeared to be a full outdoor bar setup, still in its crate. Grant refilled his coffee. By noon, a black Mercedes G-Wagon was parked in the driveway at an angle that blocked part of the sidewalk, and a man in a linen blazer was standing in the front yard talking loudly on his phone while gesturing at the movers. Grant caught pieces of it through the kitchen window. Something about a shipment, a deadline, somebody being an idiot. The man's voice carried the particular confidence of someone who was used to being listened to and wasn't interested in adjusting his volume for anyone else's comfort. Warren Bexley. Grant would learn the name within 48 hours. Everyone on Birchwood Lane would. The first week, Grant kept his distance. That was his default setting. Not unfriendly, just careful. He'd wave if he saw someone in the driveway. He'd nod if they passed on the street, but he didn't go knock on the door with a casserole or introduce himself at the mailbox. He waited to see what kind of people they were before deciding how much neighborly warmth was appropriate. What he observed in that first week wasn't encouraging. Warren Bexley was in his mid-50s, thick through the shoulders, with silver hair and the loud, expansive energy of a man who believed every room he entered was improved by his presence. He drove fast. He talked loud. He had contractors at the house every other day. New kitchen, new deck, resurfaced driveway. And he seemed to take genuine pleasure in the disruption this caused. His son was worse. Bryce Bexley was 19, broad-chested, and walked with the slow, deliberate swagger of someone who wanted you to notice him walking. He drove a white Dodge Challenger with a sound system loud enough to rattle Grant's windows 2 houses down. And he seemed to operate on the assumption that the neighborhood existed for his amusement. Grant first noticed him on a Thursday afternoon. He was outside checking his gutters when he heard raised voices from the Kowalski house, an older couple, mid-70s, who'd lived on the street for 30 years. Grant couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. One voice was calm and bewildered. The other was not. He saw Bryce walking back across the street a minute later, smirking at his phone. The Kowalski's dog had gotten into Bryce's yard, apparently. Based on what Mrs. Kowalski told Grant later, Bryce had walked over and informed her that if it happened again, he'd call animal control and make sure the dog was put down. Then he'd said a word Grant didn't like and left. Mrs. Kowalski was 73 years old, Her husband had bad knees. The dog was an 8-year-old beagle named Clover. Grant went back inside and made lunch and didn't say anything about it to Sophie, but he filed it away. The thing about Grant Holloway was that he genuinely did not want trouble. That wasn't weakness, and it wasn't naivety. It was a choice he'd made deliberately, the way you make deliberate choices when you've spent enough time in situations where trouble had real, permanent consequences. He'd joined the Navy at 22, after 2 years of college that hadn't gone anywhere in particular. He'd been good at certain things, physical discipline, staying calm under pressure, reading situations quickly. And the military had given those things a purpose. He'd made it through BUD/S, made it through SQT, and spent the next 12 years deploying to places he still didn't talk about, doing things that weren't in any public record. He'd also gotten married somewhere in the middle of all that, to a woman named Carla, who had been patient and funny and realistic about what life with someone like him actually looked like. They'd had Sophie. And then, when Sophie was 4, Carla had died. A blood clot, sudden and senseless and completely outside any threat assessment Grant had ever run. Just gone. A Tuesday afternoon in October. He'd finished out 2 more years because he didn't know what else to do. Then he'd retired, started a security logistics company with 2 former teammates, and moved to a suburb of Philadelphia because Sophie's pediatrician had been there and the school district was good, and it was the kind of place where people mowed their lawns and waved at each other, and nothing exploded. He was 38 now. The company had grown more than he'd expected. He ran it mostly remotely. Calls, documents, the occasional trip to meet with clients or government partners. He coached Sophie's volleyball team sometimes when the regular coach was sick. He went to the grocery store on Saturdays. He had a neighbor named Phil Garza, 3 houses down, who came over every couple of weeks to watch football and complain about the Eagles. It was a real life. It was a quiet life. He was not going to apologize for wanting it to stay that way. Chets. Sophie met Bryce on a Friday in early May. She didn't call it a meeting. She mentioned it at dinner the way teenagers mention things. Sideways, without making eye contact, buried under other information so you couldn't tell how much it actually bothered her. That guy from next door said something to me today. Grant looked up from his plate. Which guy? The son, Bryce. I was walking home from Lily's and he was out front. What did he say? Sophie shrugged. Just weird stuff, trying to be charming or whatever. It was kind of gross. Grant set his fork down. Gross how? Dad. Sophie, she exhaled. He asked if I wanted to come see the house, said his dad was out, made it sound like a big favor. She finally looked up. I said no and kept walking. He said something after me, nothing worth repeating. Grant picked his fork back up. He finished his dinner. He washed the dishes. After Sophie went upstairs, he stood at the kitchen sink for a while looking at the window above it, which in the dark showed him a faint reflection of himself. Tired eyes, a jaw that needed shaving, the particular stillness he fell into when he was thinking hard. He told himself it might be nothing. A teenager being stupid, which happened constantly, which didn't always require intervention. He told himself he'd watch it. Over the next 3 weeks, he watched it. Bryce had a group of friends who showed up at the house most evenings. Loud, well-dressed, the kind of young men who seemed to confuse cruelty with humor. They parked on other people's lawns. They set off fireworks at 11 on a Wednesday. They revved engines and played music and laughed at things Grant couldn't hear but could guess at from the direction of the laughter. Phil Garza told him that Bryce had nearly hit a kid on a bicycle at the end of the block and then gotten out of the car and yelled at the kid. The kid was 12. Phil said the kid cried. Bryce thought that was funny. Grant's other neighbor, a woman named Dana Chen, who worked as a physical therapist and had 2 daughters in middle school, told him that Bryce had started showing up at the end of their driveway sometimes, just standing there, watching. She'd started parking in the garage. Her daughters weren't allowed outside alone anymore. Grant didn't say much. He listened. He noted. He thought about the best ways to handle things like this, which usually involved patience and correct timing and not acting before you had a clear picture. Then Bryce came into his yard. It was a Saturday morning, the 2nd week of June. Grant was in the driveway working on the brake lines of his truck, a '09 Ford F-150 he'd bought used and maintained himself because it gave him something to do with his hands. He heard footsteps on the gravel and looked up. Bryce was standing at the edge of the driveway in athletic shorts and a tight shirt, arms crossed, looking at the truck with an expression like he was evaluating something he wasn't impressed by. "You're the dad, right?" he said. "Sophie's dad." Grant straightened up slowly. He was 6'1", 195, and he'd stayed in shape not because he was trying to prove anything, but because it was the only body he had, and he preferred it to work properly. He had a wrench in his hand and grease on his forearms, and he looked at Bryce with no expression in particular. "Grant," he said, "you're Warren's son." "Bryce." He said it like it should mean something. "I need to talk to you about your daughter." "I'm listening." Bryce shifted his weight, uncrossed his arms. "She's been walking past our house, like on purpose, making eyes at me. I'm just letting you know it's not going to happen, okay? I'm not interested, and she needs to stop." Grant looked at him for a moment. The driveway was very quiet, except for a lawnmower somewhere down the block. "She walks on the public sidewalk," Grant said. "She'll continue doing that." Something moved through Bryce's expression. Irritation, maybe surprise that he hadn't been immediately apologized to. "I'm trying to be nice here." "I know. Your daughter's got a little crush thing going on. It's embarrassing for her. I'm doing you a favor." "You've said what you came to say," Grant said. He turned back to the truck. There was a pause, long enough that Grant tracked it, long enough that he knew what was probably coming. And then he heard Bryce step forward. "Hey!" A hand grabbed his shoulder and yanked him around. "I'm talking to you." Grant moved. It wasn't a decision exactly. It was something trained into muscle memory over thousands of repetitions. A defense response that activated before conscious thought finished forming. He turned with Bryce's pull instead of against it, used the momentum, got a grip on Bryce's wrist and then his shirt collar, and applied pressure to a specific point on the forearm that sent Bryce's face directly toward the gravel without Grant ever raising a fist or losing his balance. The whole thing took maybe 2 seconds. Bryce hit his knees hard and made a sound that was half shock, half pain. Grant held the position, not hurting him, just controlling him, one hand on the wrist, one on the back of the collar, for about 3 counts. Then he let go and stepped back. Bryce scrambled to his feet. His face was red and his eyes were doing something complicated. "You—" He couldn't finish the sentence. His mouth opened and closed. "You grabbed me," Grant said. His voice was calm. "This was also training. I'd recommend not doing that again." "You're going to regret that," Bryce said. His voice had gone tight and strange. "You have no idea who my father is." "You should ice your knee," Grant said. "That gravel's rough." Bryce left. Grant wiped his hands on a shop rag and went back to the brake lines. His hands were steady. That was something he'd noticed about himself over the years. How situations that should be adrenaline flooding just weren't anymore. He didn't feel calm because he was confident. He felt calm because some part of his nervous system had been recalibrated a long time ago and no longer registered a 19-year-old with a bad attitude as a threat worth escalating a heart rate over. But he knew, with the same certainty he'd used to read 100 other situations, that this wasn't over. Warren Bexley showed up at his door 40 minutes later. He was in a different linen blazer, this one cream-colored, and he had the energy of a man who'd spent the drive over working himself into a specific emotional temperature. Behind him, Bryce stood on the front walk with his arms folded, still red-faced, a bruise starting to show on his knee. "What you did to my son," Warren said, without introducing himself, without any preamble at all, "is assault. I have attorneys." "Your son grabbed me," Grant said. "He was standing in the doorway. He hadn't opened the storm door." "He's telling me you jumped him for no reason." "Then he's not telling you the truth." Warren's jaw tightened. He was used to being believed, Grant could tell. Used to his version of events being the version that mattered. "You want to talk about truth? I'll tell you what I know. I know you're a single father working from home, which means you have a lot to lose. I know people in this town. I know judges. And I know what happens to middle-class nobodies when they put their hands on someone in my family." He said it the way people say things when they're used to the saying being enough, when the threat itself has always been the last word. Grant looked at him. He thought about 14 years of people who hadn't been bluffing. He thought about the difference between a man who would actually do something and a man who needed you to believe he would. If you believe a crime was committed, Grant said, you should call the police. He closed the door. Sophie was on the stairs behind him. She'd heard everything. Her face was doing something careful and controlled, the way her face did when she was upset and trying not to show it. Are we in trouble? She asked. Grant looked up at her. She was 16 and she hadn't asked to be involved in any of this, and she was trying very hard to seem unafraid, which meant she was afraid. And that was the thing that settled in his chest like something heavy and cold. No, he said, we're not in trouble. She searched his face for a moment. Then she nodded and went back upstairs. He stood in the front hallway a moment longer, listening to the sound of the Bexleys retreating down the front walk, Warren's voice carrying back, mid-sentence, the words indistinct. Outside, Birchwood Lane was the same as it always was. Quiet houses, tidy yards, a bird bath with no birds in it, a warm afternoon going golden at the edges. It looked peaceful. Grant knew better. Warren Bexley did not call the police. Grant had expected that too. Men like Warren didn't go to the police when they felt wronged. They went to lawyers, they made calls, they worked angles. The police were for people who needed institutions to do their intimidating. Warren preferred to do it himself. What Warren did instead was talk. And on Birchwood Lane, where people had lived beside each other long enough to notice everything, talk moved fast. By Sunday evening, Phil Garza called Grant from his back deck and said, "Hey, I'm hearing some things. You want to tell me your version before I decide which one to believe?" Grant told him the short version. Phil listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Phil. "So he grabbed you," Phil said. "He did. And you put him on the ground." "Yes." A pause. "Was it, like, did you hurt him?" "No." Another pause, shorter. "Good," Phil said, and that was the end of it. But not everyone on the street had Phil's particular way of processing information. Dana Chen called Tuesday morning, her voice lower than usual, the kind of low people use when they're saying something in a house with children present and don't want the children to hear. "Warren came to our door yesterday," she said. "He was asking questions about you, about Sophie. He wanted to know how long you'd lived here, whether you had a job, whether you'd ever had problems with anyone on the street." Grant was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you'd lived here 3 years, and you coached my daughter's volleyball team." A beat. "Then I told him I had a patient coming and closed the door." "Thank you, Dana." "Grant." Her voice shifted slightly. He asked if Sophie had ever seemed, his word was troubled, like he was building something. Grant set his coffee mug down on the counter very carefully. "I understand. I just thought you should know what he's doing." He stood in the kitchen after he hung up and let himself feel it for a moment. The particular anger of a parent, which is not like regular anger at all. It's sharper. It has an edge that other kinds of anger don't. And it was harder to be disciplined about, because discipline was easier when the threat was pointed at him and not at Sophie. He breathed it out, filed it away in that place he'd learned to keep things until they were needed. He went back to work. The trouble with having a job that nobody understood was that it made you easy to underestimate. Grant's company, Halcyon Security Solutions, had started as a 3-person operation in a rented office space outside Philadelphia. Him, Marcus Webb, who'd been his team leader in the teams, and a woman named Diane Cho, who'd spent 15 years in defense logistics before burning out on the government side and deciding the private sector had better coffee. They'd taken small contracts at first, physical security assessments, transportation protocols for sensitive cargo, a handful of consulting engagements with defense subcontractors who needed someone who actually understood operational risk. That was 6 years ago. They had 41 employees now, 3 offices, and a contract portfolio that had grown in ways Grant hadn't fully planned for, mostly because Marcus was aggressively good at business development and Diane was aggressively good at keeping clients happy once they arrived. Grant himself was better at the structural stuff, the protocols, the assessments, the pieces that required someone who could think about risk the way a practitioner thought about it, not a theorist. He'd never advertised any of this. Not to neighbors, not to the parents at Sophie's school, not to anyone who didn't need to know. He told people he worked in security consulting, which was true and sufficiently boring that most people stopped asking. He drove a used truck. He kept his lawn reasonable but not impressive. He went to PTA meetings when he could and drank bad coffee in folding chairs and talked about fundraiser logistics with the same focused patience he'd once used to plan movement routes in places that don't make the news. He liked it that way. There was something genuinely satisfying about being unknown, about being, to everyone around him, just some guy. Bryce Bexley had mistaken that for weakness. Grant had watched it happen, had seen exactly the moment Bryce registered his calm response to the confrontation not as control, but as passivity, as a target. That was a mistake a lot of people made. Grant had learned not to correct it until correction became necessary. The first week of July arrived hot and close, the kind of Philadelphia summer heat that makes the air feel thick and used. Sophie had taken a summer job at a garden center 3 miles away, which meant she rode her bike there Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and Grant picked her up in the evenings. It was a routine, and routines were useful because they created predictability, and predictability made deviations easier to spot. He spotted the deviation on a Thursday. He'd arrived at the garden center at 5:45, parked in the lot, was checking email on his phone when he looked up and saw Sophie coming out with a girl named Lily, both of them with their bikes, and behind them, 20 feet back, leaning against the fence that ran along the parking lot perimeter, was Bryce. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, just watching. Grant got out of the truck. He walked across the lot at a steady pace, not fast, not slow. Sophie saw him coming, and her expression did a quick, complicated thing. Relief, and something else, something that might have been embarrassment that she needed to be relieved. She didn't say anything, just loaded her bike into the truck bed while Lily made very focused eye contact with her phone. Grant walked past both of them to the fence. Bryce saw him coming and straightened up, arms uncrossing, chin coming up. He was wearing his gym clothes. He apparently trained somewhere, mixed martial arts or boxing or something. Grant had seen the equipment bags going in and out of the house. He had the look of someone who'd been working at being physically intimidating for long enough that it had started to feel like an identity. "Something I can help you with?" Grant said. Bryce smiled. It was a specific kind of smile, the kind that's meant to be unnerving. "Free country." "It is. And my daughter's workplace is private property. I'm on the sidewalk." He was, technically. The fence marked the property line and Bryce's sneakers were on the public concrete. It was the kind of technicality that people use when they know exactly what they're doing. Grant looked at him for a moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He just looked, the same way he'd once looked at an interpreter who was feeding them bad information and needed to understand that the conversation was over. "I'm not going to threaten you," Grant said. "I don't do that. But I want to be clear about one thing, man to man." Bryce kept the smile, but something behind it moved. "My daughter is 16. She goes to work. She comes home. She doesn't need an audience." Grant paused. "Whatever you've decided this is, this thing between you and me, keep it between you and me. You understand what I'm saying?" "There's no thing," Bryce said. "I was just walking." "Good." Grant turned and walked back to the truck. In the cab, Sophie was already buckled in, staring forward. Lily had disappeared. They drove for 3 minutes without talking. The radio was off. The AC was running, a low mechanical hum. "You didn't yell at him," Sophie said finally. "No. Dad," she turned to look at him. "It's been like 5 weeks. He keeps showing up places. I told Lily she shouldn't walk home with me anymore because I don't want her around when..." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I'm not scared of him. I'm really tired." Grant kept his eyes on the road. "I know." "What does that mean?" "You know?" "It means I hear you." "It means you're not going to do anything." The truck hit a red light. Grant stopped and put both hands on the steering wheel. "It means I'm doing things you can't see, and I need you to trust me for a little longer." Sophie looked out the window. When the light changed, she said, "How much longer?" He didn't answer because he didn't know. And she knew him well enough to know that silence meant he genuinely didn't, which was at least honest. She turned the radio on herself, found a station, and let the music do the talking for the rest of the ride home. The property damage happened on a Saturday night. Grant woke at 2:14 in the morning to a sound he couldn't immediately categorize. Not an alarm, not a voice, something duller and more immediate. He was out of bed before he'd fully processed what woke him, old habit, crossing to the window in the dark. His truck. Someone had keyed the driver's side from the cab door all the way to the rear wheel well, a long, savage scratch that caught the streetlight and gleamed like a scar. He stood at the window and looked at it, and felt the anger come up fast and hot. And then, because he'd had years of practice, felt himself put a hand on it and hold it still. He didn't go outside. There was nothing to do about it at 2 in the morning, and going outside would accomplish exactly nothing except wake the neighbors and give whoever did it the satisfaction of having gotten a reaction. He went back to bed. He lay there for a while. He slept eventually because he'd learned to sleep under worse conditions, but not well. In the morning, he walked around the truck and documented the damage with his phone. 21 photographs, different angles, close and wide. The scratch was deep, right down to the primer in places. A body shop would say $400 to $600. He filed a police report online, attaching the photos, listing the estimated damage, noting his suspicion without stating it as fact. He had no proof. That was the thing. He had a bad neighbor and a strong suspicion and a truck that needed a new paint job, none of which added up to anything actionable. He knew this. He'd operated in environments where knowing who was responsible and being able to prove it were two entirely different problems. He was thinking about all of this on Monday morning, standing in the driveway with a cup of coffee, when Bryce walked out of the house next door. Their eyes met. Bryce paused on his front steps, keys in hand, that same smile from the parking lot finding its way back onto his face. He looked at the truck, then at Grant. Then he walked to his Challenger and got in and drove away. It was so deliberate, so precise in its messaging. Look what I did. What are you going to do about it? Grant drank his coffee. What Bryce didn't understand, what he fundamentally couldn't understand, because he'd spent 19 years having his status visible on the surface, in his car and his clothes and his father's name, was that Grant Holloway didn't need anyone to know what he was capable of. He'd never needed that. He'd spent 12 years being capable of things that weren't in any public record, and he'd come home from all of it without a single trophy, without a single story he told at parties, and he'd been entirely fine with that arrangement. Bryce wanted him rattled, wanted him reactive, wanted him to do something stupid that Warren could use. Grant went inside and started his workday. Warren Bexley made his move the following Wednesday. Grant was on a conference call with Diane and a partner in their D.C. office when his personal cell rang twice in a row, a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. When the call ended, he listened to the message. It was a man identifying himself as an attorney named Gerald Fitch calling on behalf of Warren Bexley regarding an incident that had occurred on June 7th involving Warren's son, Bryce Bexley, and a physical altercation. The attorney's voice was smooth and measured and carried the particular tone of someone who made these calls regularly and considered them a form of performance. He used words like unprovoked and excessive force and damages, and ended by saying he'd appreciate a callback at Grant's earliest convenience. Grant listened to the message twice. Then he called Marcus. "Interesting development," he said when Marcus picked up, and explained. Marcus was quiet for a second. "He's not going to sue you." "Probably not. He's trying to make you spend money on a lawyer and freak out. That's my read." "What do you need?" "I have a call with a contractor at DOD next week," Grant said. "I want to make sure there's nothing in any filing or complaint that could look bad to them without context. I'll have Diane prep a summary." "Thank you." A pause. "Also, quietly, not urgently, I'd like to know more about Warren Bexley's business interests." Marcus's voice shifted almost imperceptibly. "Casually curious or actually curious?" "Actually curious." "Give me a few days." Grant hung up and called a lawyer he'd used twice before, a woman named Harriet Bloom, who charged too much and was worth every cent. He told her the situation. She told him it was a nuisance play, and she'd send a letter of representation to Gerald Fitch's office that afternoon, which would signal that Grant wasn't handling this alone. She said it in the tone of someone who'd seen this movie before and found it tedious. "He's not going to litigate this," she said. "Too much discovery risk." The sun grabbed you, in your own driveway, in front of your vehicle. There were no witnesses. There were security cameras, not pointed that direction. He'd installed them toward the street, not the side yard, an oversight he'd already corrected. It still doesn't matter. Even his own attorney knows this goes nowhere in court. The goal is pressure. A brief pause. Is there a police report on the property damage? Filed it Saturday. Good. We'll reference that in the letter. It establishes a pattern of harassment. Her voice was brisk and professional and entirely unbothered. Grant, I handle cases like this every month. Money talks, and people like Warren Bexley know that threatening someone with legal costs is often just as effective as actually winning a case. You're not playing that game. So we'll respond professionally, document everything, and let him realize his leverage doesn't exist. After he hung up, he sat for a moment in his office. A converted spare bedroom, bookshelves, a standing desk, a window that overlooked the backyard where Sophie's old swing set still stood because he'd never gotten around to taking it down. He thought about the letter going to Gerald Fitch's office. He thought about Warren's face when he realized Grant had a lawyer and documentation and hadn't freaked out. He thought about Sophie's face in the truck. I'm really tired. So was he, if he was being honest. The weekend Warren escalated things properly. It started with a dinner. The Hendersons at the end of the block hosted a neighborhood cookout, third summer in a row, a standing tradition. Paper plates and potato salad, and somebody's husband burning chicken on the grill, and children running through sprinklers in the backyard, and the general low, pleasant noise of people who'd been neighbors long enough to relax around each other. Grant went because Sophie wanted to, and because not going would have been noticed, and because he didn't want to seem like he was hiding. Warren Bexley came. He arrived with a bottle of wine and his linen blazer, in despite of the 90-degree heat, and worked the gathering the way a man works a room. Handshakes, names, compliments on the house, questions about people's children. He was good at it. Grant could see that. There was genuine skill in the way he moved through people. He made each person feel briefly like the most interesting person at the party. He got to Grant at the drinks table near the cooler. It was probably not accidental. Grant, Warren said it like they were old friends. I'm glad you came. I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk. Warren. Listen. He dropped his voice slightly, the signal for a private conversation in a public space. I think things have gotten more complicated than they needed to be, between our households. Bryce is a young man, he's got a temper, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I'd like to find a way to put this behind us. Grant looked at him steadily. What does that look like? Simple. My attorney sends a letter withdrawing any potential claims. You do the same. We go back to being neighbors. Warren spread his hands, an open gesture. We're adults. The property damage, Grant said. Warren's expression didn't change. What damage? Someone keyed my truck, filed a police report, 2 weeks ago Saturday. I don't know anything about that. I understand. A pause. Warren studied him. You're a hard man to read, Grant. I'll give you that. I'm really not. Look, I'm trying to extend an olive branch here. I'm giving you an easy out because the alternative... He let it sit there a moment, unfinished. My attorney's already made some calls. Government contracts are... There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of compliance documentation, accusations of violent behavior by personnel with access to sensitive logistics. I'm not personnel, Grant said. I'm a contractor owner. Something moved through Warren's expression, a tiny recalibration, like he'd set a line he was confident in and found it didn't land the way he expected. Then you have even more to lose, Warren said, recovering. A business. A reputation. Grant picked up a water bottle from the cooler. I'm going to go find my daughter, he said. Enjoy the party, Warren. He walked away without looking back. Across the yard, Sophie was sitting on a picnic bench with Lily and a couple of other girls, laughing at something on someone's phone. Normal teenager stuff. She looked relaxed in a way she hadn't in weeks, the tight watchfulness that had been living around her eyes temporarily released in the company of her friends. Grant stood at the edge of the yard and drank his water and let himself just watch her be 16 for a minute. He wasn't going to let Warren Bexley take this from her. He wasn't going to let the next year of her life become smaller because a man with money and a loud voice decided he was entitled to use them. He just needed a little more information, a little more time. Marcus had sent him a text that morning. Interesting stuff on the Bexley Company. Call me Monday. Grant had read it and not replied. There was a cookout to get through first. He found Phil Garza at the grill, taking over from the husband who'd burned the chicken, and stood next to him and talked about nothing in particular for a while. The Eagles draft, a pothole on Merchant Street that had been there since spring, whether the Hendersons' new deck would hold up through winter. Normal, boring, real conversation between two men at a neighborhood cookout. Bryce never showed. Grant noticed that too. It was the first evening in weeks that he hadn't appeared somewhere at the edge of things. The end of the driveway, the parking lot, the sidewalk in front of Dana Chen's house. His absence had a different quality than his presence. Something deliberate about it, the same way the keyed truck had felt deliberate, like a pause before a next move. He drove Sophie home at 9. She fell asleep in the passenger seat before they got to their street, her head tilted against the window. He drove carefully, took the turn slowly, parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before waking her. The Bexley house was lit up, every window, and there was music coming from somewhere inside, too low to make out, but present. Sophie stirred. We home? Yeah, he said. We're home. She got out, still half asleep, padded up the front steps, fumbled with her key. Grant sat in the truck a moment longer, looking at the lit-up house next door. In one of the upper windows, a shadow moved across the curtain and stopped. Stood there. He couldn't tell if it was Bryce or Warren or someone else entirely. He couldn't tell if they were looking at him or just standing near the window. He got out of the truck and went inside and locked the door behind him. And that night, he slept with his phone on the nightstand and the volume turned up. And if he woke twice at small sounds that turned out to be nothing, he didn't write that down anywhere. Some things you just carry. Marcus called Monday morning at 8:47, which meant he'd been at his desk since at least 7, which was normal for Marcus. Warren Bexley, Marcus said without preamble. Bexley Commercial Properties, mostly mid-size real estate development, retail spaces, some light industrial, a couple of mixed-use projects in the Mid-Atlantic region. About $60 million in assets, give or take, depending on which quarter you're looking at. He's been in business about 22 years. Grant was at his standing desk, coffee going cold beside him. And he has 3 active government contracts. 2 are small, facility maintenance stuff, barely worth mentioning. The third is interesting. Marcus paused in the particular way he paused when something was actually interesting, and he wanted to make sure you understood that. Logistics support for a regional federal operations center outside Baltimore. They lease warehouse space from Bexley through a subcontractor arrangement. It's worth roughly $40 million over 5 years. Grant was quiet for a moment. Who's the prime contractor? Ferris Dalton Group. I know them. I know you know them, which is why I'm telling you this. Another pause. The contract went through a competitive bid process 2 years ago. Standard stuff. But there's a compliance flag in the procurement record. Minor, unresolved, probably an oversight. The kind of thing that nobody looks at unless somebody looks at it. Marcus? I'm just telling you what I found. I know what you're telling me. Marcus let a beat go by. How bad is it getting over there? Grant looked out the window. The Bexley house sat visible from this angle. The side yard, the new deck Warren had put in, a corner of the driveway where the G-Wagon was parked at its usual sidewalk blocking angle. It's manageable. Sophie okay? She's tired. She's handling it. She's 16. She's also Carla's daughter, Grant said. She handles things. There was a brief quiet on the line that had something in it. Marcus had known Carla, had been at the funeral, had been one of 3 people who'd sat with Grant in a hospital waiting room on a Tuesday in October and not said anything because there was nothing to say. Some silences between people who've been through things together carry weight without needing to be explained. Okay, Marcus said finally. I'm here if you need me. I know, thank you. He hung up and stood looking at his cold coffee for a while. Then he picked it up and drank it anyway. What Marcus had laid out was not a plan. Grant was clear about that with himself. It was information, and information wasn't the same as intention. He hadn't gone looking for leverage on Warren Bexley. He'd asked Marcus to look into the man's business interests because understanding an adversary was basic operational sense. The same thing he'd done in every environment where he needed to understand who was across from him. What he did with information was a separate question, and that question depended entirely on what happened next. What happened next was Bryce. It started with a Friday. The third Friday in July, a day that started unremarkably. Grant had a morning call with Diane, spent 2 hours on a proposal document, ate lunch at his desk because the proposal was due Monday and he was behind. Sophie was home for the day, no shift at the garden center, and she'd spent most of the morning on video calls with Lily and another friend named Priya. The specific sustained noise of teenage girls talking about things that mattered entirely to them and no one else, which Grant found oddly reassuring as background sound. At 2 in the afternoon, he heard Sophie's voice from downstairs change register. Not louder, not alarmed, just different, tight, the way voices get when something unwanted is happening and you're trying to manage it without making it bigger. He was down the stairs in under 10 seconds. She was standing at the front door, which she'd opened about 6 inches, her hand on the frame. Bryce was on the porch, not at the edge of the porch, on it, 3 feet from the door. "I just want to talk to her for 2 minutes," he was saying. His voice had that studied, casual quality that people use when they're performing calm and not actually feeling it. 2 minutes, Sophie. It's not a big deal." "I said no," Sophie said. Her voice was steady. Grant registered that, the steadiness of it, and felt something complicated move through him, pride and anger arriving at the same time, occupying the same space. Grant put his hand flat on the door and pushed it fully open. Bryce took a half step back. Not far. Just enough to rebalance, the reflex of someone who'd been caught at something and was recalculating. "She said no," Grant said. Bryce's eyes went from Sophie to Grant, and the calculated ease came back into his posture, shoulders dropping, chin coming up. "We were just talking." "She said no. That ends the conversation." Grant held the door and looked at him without aggression, without visible anger, just looked. "You need to leave my porch." Bryce's jaw shifted. He looked at Sophie once more, a specific kind of look, the kind that was meant to be noticed, that was a message disguised as a glance. And then he walked off the porch and across the yard with his hands in his pockets and his pace deliberately slow. Grant watched him until he was through the front door of the Bexley house. He turned around. Sophie was leaning against the wall of the foyer, arms wrapped around herself, looking at the floor. She wasn't crying, she was just done. There was a quality to her posture that he recognized from years earlier, from the worst stretch after Carla died, when she'd run out of the energy it took to keep her face arranged and just let it go slack. "You okay?" he said. "He's not going to stop." She said it flat, like a fact, no particular emotion behind it. "He's not scared of you. He's not scared of anything you do. He thinks you're—" She stopped. "What does he think?" She looked up. "He told Tyler Henderson last week that you're a pushover, that you talk big but you've got nothing, that his dad is going to have you fired or sued or whatever." She pressed her lips together. "Tyler told me. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want you to do something, and then what? And then have it get worse." She looked at him directly now, and her eyes were tired in a way that no 16-year-old should be tired. "Dad, I'm not stupid. I know you could probably hurt him really bad if you wanted to. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about what he does after. I'm worried about what his dad does after. I'm worried that I don't want to have to move." Grant looked at his daughter. He thought about what it meant that she'd been carrying that particular fear quietly, by herself, for however many weeks. He thought about the part of fatherhood that nobody talks about honestly, which is that sometimes you can't fix things immediately. And the people you love most have to live inside the problem while you work on it, and there is nothing you can do about that lag time except know it's there. "We're not moving," he said. "Okay? I mean it." "I know you mean it." She unfolded her arms. "I'm going back upstairs." He let her go. He stood in the foyer for a while after she'd gone up, looking at the front door, at the slice of porch visible through the glass panel beside it. Then he went back to his proposal document and finished it because it was due Monday and the company didn't run itself. The thing Bryce had said to Tyler Henderson spread in the way things spread in neighborhoods like this one. Not like news, which travels fast and loud, but like water finding low ground, slow and persistent and hard to stop. Grant heard variations of it from Phil, from Dana Chen, eventually from Bob Henderson himself at the end of the block, who seemed embarrassed to be reporting it, but felt Grant should know. The version Bob repeated was blunter than Sophie's. Bryce had apparently said, in front of several teenagers, that Grant Holloway was exactly what he looked like. A broke single dad with a nothing job who'd gotten lucky once and thought it made him tough. That his little judo move in the driveway was the most exciting thing that had happened in his miserable life. That if Grant ever actually came at him for real, he'd spend a week in the hospital. Grant thanked Bob and went home and did not think too hard about the specific phrasing because the phrasing was designed to be thought about. What he did think about, over the following week, was the broader situation and what it required. Harriet Bloom's letter to Gerald Fitch had produced a response. Legally careful, non-committal, not quite backing down, but not advancing either. The police report on the truck damage was still open with no suspects listed. Bryce continued to exist in the neighborhood the way he'd always existed in it, loudly, presently, without consequence. And something was shifting. Grant could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. Bryce wasn't scared, which meant he was going to push further. The showing up at this garden center, the porch visit, the public statements, those were escalating steps, each one testing whether there was a line and where it was. What Grant was watching for was the next step, because there would be one. He didn't have to wait long. The Ramsey family 3 houses north hosted the annual neighborhood cookout, a bigger one than the Hendersons, a tradition going back 12 years that essentially functioned as a summer reunion for Birchwood Lane and the 2 adjacent streets. Carol Ramsey sent physical paper invitations every year, which Grant found endearing. He'd been to 4 of them. They were genuinely nice events. Too much food, too many people, kids everywhere, someone always bringing a guitar they couldn't play well, the steady accumulated goodwill of people who'd seen each other through hard winters and new babies and for sale signs. Sophie wanted to go. Of course she did. Lily would be there. Priya, half her school year was in that neighborhood somewhere. She put on a sundress and brushed her hair and came downstairs looking like a person who'd decided not to let Bryce Bexley take her summer from her, which was the bravest decision Grant had seen anyone make in recent memory. "Ready?" she said. "Ready," he said. They walked 3 houses up. The Ramsey yard was already full when they arrived. 50, 60 people, charcoal going, kids running, Carol Ramsey in a yellow apron directing traffic with a spatula like she was running a field operation. Phil Garza waved from near the drinks. Dana Chen was there with both her daughters, Bob Henderson, everyone it seemed. And then Bryce arrived. He came through the side gate 20 minutes after Grant and Sophie, and he didn't come alone. He had 2 of his regular friends with him, big guys, the kind that had been recruited for their physical presence. And he was carrying what Grant registered immediately because he was trained to register things like that, fighting gloves, the compressed fingerless kind that serious practitioners used for sparring. They were hanging off his right hand by the wrist strap, casual, like he'd just grabbed them off a hook on his way out the door, or like he'd grabbed them deliberately because he wanted them visible. Grant watched him come through the gate and noted the gloves and noted the trajectory. Not toward the drinks, not toward the food, straight across the yard in a line that ended at Grant. He noted the way Bryce's friends fanned out slightly as they walked, the unconscious staging of people who were there for something specific. He also noticed, peripherally, without looking, that the yard had started to register the arrival. Conversations dipping, eyes moving, the particular silence that moves through a crowd when something is happening. Sophie had seen him too. She was standing next to Lily, and her hand had gone still around her cup. Bryce stopped about 8 feet away. "Holloway," he said, loud enough to carry. He wasn't trying to have a private conversation. He never had been. "I've been wanting to do something, and I figured here's as good a place as any." Grant looked at him. "Bryce, you put your hands on me in your driveway." He said it to the crowd as much as to Grant, his voice carrying the particular projection of someone who'd rehearsed this. "I let it go because, whatever, I was caught off guard. But I'm not the kind of person who lets things like that sit." The yard was very quiet now. 30, 40 people had stopped talking. Carol Ramsey had lowered her spatula. "So I want to settle it," Bryce continued. "Right here, you and me, in front of everybody. You got something? Let's see it." He shook the gloves once, a loose gesture. "Or you can apologize in front of all these people and we'll call it done." Grant heard Sophie's voice from across the yard. "Dad?" Just his name, not loud. He looked at Bryce, then he looked at the crowd. Phil Garza's face, which had gone very still. Dana Chen with her hands on her daughter's shoulders. Bob Henderson with his mouth slightly open. All these people he'd lived beside for 3 years, who'd been careful around him ever since this started, who'd been kind and had tried not to get pulled in. He thought about what happened if he walked away. Not to him. He didn't care particularly about what Bryce thought or said about him, but to Sophie, who would go back to school in 6 weeks, who would walk these streets for the next 2 years, who would hear whatever story Bryce told about this moment in every variation it mutated into. He thought about what happened if he accepted. A fight at a neighborhood cookout, police involvement, exactly the scenario Warren could use to build whatever narrative he was trying to build. And then he thought about something else, about what he actually knew about Bryce Bexley, which was 19 years old, trained in some martial art for a few years, strong, physically confident, completely unacquainted with what happened when physical confidence met something it genuinely couldn't predict. Sometimes the cleanest solution was the obvious one. "All right," Grant said. The word landed in the quiet of the yard and sat there. Bryce blinked. Just once, just briefly, a tiny flicker of surprise that he recovered from quickly. "Yeah?" he said. "Yeah." Grant set his drink down on the nearest table. "But here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop coming to my property. You're going to stop showing up where my daughter works. And you're going to leave every person on this street alone. If we do this and I have your word on those things, we're done." Bryce's mouth curved. "You're negotiating? Right now?" "I'm being clear about the terms." "Fine." He said it like it cost him nothing. "Sure. Win and I'll leave your precious family alone." His friends moved back slightly, opening space. "Lose, and you apologize to me and my father in front of everybody here." Grant nodded once. Then he took off his watch, a plain steel Timex he'd had for years, and put it in his shirt pocket. Carol Ramsey said, "Someone should call." And Phil Garza said quietly, "Carol, let it go." And the yard rearranged itself into a rough circle, the way crowds always do when they've accepted something is happening and have decided to witness it. Bryce pulled the gloves on properly and rolled his neck and shifted his weight in the practiced way of someone warming up for something familiar. He bounced twice on his toes. He looked comfortable. He'd been in sparring matches, competitions, controlled environments where the rules were known and the mat was clean and someone would stop it if it went wrong. Grant stood still. He didn't bounce. He didn't roll his neck. He stood with his weight even, hands loose at his sides, and looked at the space between himself and Bryce with the particular quality of attention that was not aggression and not fear, but something else entirely. The suspended readiness of someone who has trained his reactions past the point where thinking is required. Bryce moved first. A right jab, fast and technically decent. He'd been taught properly. Grant could see that. He moved offline, inside the punch's extension, let it go past his ear by 4 inches. Bryce followed with a left hook and Grant rolled under it and stepped back to reset. Clean. He hadn't touched Bryce, hadn't thrown anything back. Bryce's eyes changed slightly. He'd expected contact. He came again, faster. A combination, jab cross body shot, driving forward. Grant backed and circled, absorbed the angle changes, kept the distance. The body shot grazed his ribs because he let it. It was faster to absorb than to move fully, and he wanted to understand how Bryce committed his weight when he extended. Hard. He committed hard. He leaned into his punches with the confidence of someone used to being the bigger person in the room. Bryce threw a spinning back kick next, the kind of thing that looks spectacular in a gym and occasionally works against someone who hasn't seen it. Grant read the shoulder rotation that telegraphed it, stepped inside the kick's arc, felt it glance off his hip instead of landing clean, and was already moving to where Bryce's balance would be at the completion of the spin. "Stop running," Bryce said, breathing already heavier. "Fight me." Grant didn't answer. He was conserving breath and he had nothing to say. Bryce rushed him, pure aggression, a tackle attempt, driving with his legs. It was the most dangerous thing he'd done because it changed the geometry of the encounter, and his legs were strong. Grant felt the impact as Bryce's shoulder hit his midsection, felt himself move backward, didn't fight the momentum, used it, got his arm around the back of Bryce's neck as they went, twisted his hips, redirected the force sideways instead of straight back. They went down together but not evenly. Grant came down with Bryce's momentum already redirected, got a knee under himself, ended up on top in a position that anyone who'd trained in any grappling discipline would have recognized immediately as finished. Bryce was face down, one arm controlled and extended at an angle that created significant pressure on the shoulder joint without requiring any force. His other arm was under him and couldn't generate any useful leverage. His legs were free, but they couldn't reach anything that mattered. He tried to push up anyway. The shoulder pressure increased automatically, not because Grant applied more force, but because of the geometry of the position. Bryce made a sound. "Don't," Grant said quietly. Not to the crowd. To Bryce, close, so only he could hear. "You'll hurt your shoulder. Stop." Bryce's body went still. His breathing was ragged against the grass. "Say done," Grant said. Same quiet voice. 4 seconds of silence. The yard was absolutely still. Somewhere a kid who hadn't understood what was happening laughed at something and was immediately shushed by a parent. "Done," Bryce said. Tight, barely audible. Grant released the arm and stood up and stepped back. Bryce got up slowly, and it was in the getting up that everything was visible. The redness in his face, the grass on his shirt, the way he wouldn't look at his friends, the particular damage that comes not from physical pain but from being seen to lose cleanly. In under 90 seconds, without a single punch thrown, in front of 50 people who would remember it. He looked at Grant once. Something moved through his expression that was harder to categorize than anger. Something younger, almost, like a layer had been stripped off and underneath it was just a 19-year-old who'd never once genuinely been stopped. Grant looked back at him and didn't add anything to the moment. He picked his drink up off the table. He looked across the yard at Sophie. She was standing very still with her cup in both hands, and she was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face in a long time. Since she was small, maybe, before the world had complicated itself. Something that was not quite relief, not quite pride, but was close to both of those. He held her eyes for a second. She gave a small nod, the private language of people who know each other well. And then she turned back to Lily and said something, and Lily laughed, and the conversation started again. Bryce left the yard without speaking to anyone. His friends went with him, quieter than they'd arrived. The cookout crowd gradually reorganized itself, sound returning, conversations resuming, the grill resuming its function, Carol Ramsey reapplying herself to the spatula with visible relief. Phil Garza materialized next to Grant within about 45 seconds. He had a beer. He offered one to Grant. "Well," Phil said. "Yeah," Grant said. "You didn't hit him." "No reason to." Phil thought about this. "He's not going to see it that way." "I know." "Warren's going to hear about this in about 11 minutes. "I know that too." Phil nodded slowly and looked at the space where Bryce had been standing. "You know what I kept thinking? The whole time?" He took a drink. "I kept thinking Grant's not even sweating." Grant looked down at himself. It was true. He was warm, his ribs hurt where the body shot had landed, and his right hip would probably bruise from the kick. But he wasn't sweating, not visibly. "I'm sweating," he said. "Not so anyone would know," Phil said, and something in his voice was not quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. The way men express those things to each other when they're not sure they're allowed to say it directly. They stood there a while. The cookout continued around them. Someone brought out a cake. Someone's kid started crying about something unrelated. The evening light went gold and long across the Ramseys' lawn. Grant finished his beer. He thought about Warren Bexley getting the call. He thought about what a man like Warren did when his son had been embarrassed in front of the neighborhood. He thought about the conversation Marcus had flagged, the compliance issue and the procurement record, the name Ferris Dalton. He thought about Harriet Bloom saying, "The goal is pressure." What he hadn't told Harriet, what he hadn't told anyone, because it hadn't been relevant until now, was that pressure worked in both directions, that it wasn't just something done to you, that sometimes the application of it was simply a matter of knowing where to put your hands. He didn't think about any of this for very long. The evening was warm, Sophie was laughing somewhere behind him, and Phil was asking about the Eagles' secondary in a way that required a genuine opinion. He gave one. They argued mildly. Phil finished his beer and went to get another one, and Grant looked up at the sky, which was doing that thing it did in July, where the blue goes so deep at dusk that it looks almost impossible, the kind of color that doesn't photograph right. It was a good evening. He let it be that. But Warren Bexley's call was coming, and they both knew it, and when the sun went down and he walked home with Sophie through the blue dark of the summer street, the Bexley house was lit in every window again, the way it had been that night he'd sat in the truck. This time, Grant didn't stop to look at it. He went inside. He locked the door. He made sure the alarm was set, and he waited for whatever came next with the particular patience of someone who had long since learned the difference between the end of a fight and the end of a war. Warren called the police that same night. Grant knew it was coming. He'd known it from the moment he stood up off that grass and looked at Bryce's face, had known the same way you know a storm is coming, not because you can see it, but because the pressure changes and the air tastes different. Warren Bexley did not lose gracefully. Nothing in the man's behavior over the past 2 months suggested he had any capacity for accepting an outcome that wasn't his. The cruiser arrived at 9:41. Grant saw the lights through the front window. No siren, just the slow pulse of the light bar, and he went to the door before they knocked. 2 officers, both young, one holding a notepad with the particular neutrality of someone who'd drawn a domestic dispute call on a Friday and was managing his own feelings about it. "Mr. Holloway?" the taller one said. His nameplate read Decker. "Yes. We've received a complaint about an altercation this evening at a neighborhood gathering. Warren Bexley and his son Bryce are alleging that you assaulted Bryce at the Ramsey residence on Caldwell Street." "I was there," Grant said. "You want to come in?" They did. He put them in the living room and offered water, which Decker declined, and the other officer, Price, younger, looked like he might be 23, accepted because it was a hot night. Grant sat across from them in the chair that faced the door, old habit, and answered their questions in the flat, factual way he answered all questions he didn't have any reason to hedge around. He told them Bryce had arrived at the cookout with fighting gloves and issued a public challenge in front of approximately 50 witnesses. He told them he had accepted the challenge with stated conditions. He told them the encounter lasted less than 2 minutes and ended with Bryce verbally conceding. He told them he had not struck Bryce at any point during the encounter, had not caused any visible injury, and had stepped back immediately upon Bryce's surrender. "The Bexleys are saying you attacked him without provocation," Decker said. He was watching Grant with the measured skepticism of someone who'd heard a lot of conflicting stories and had developed a method for sorting through them. 50 people watched it happen, Grant said. The Ramseys hosted. Carol and David Ramsey, Phil Garza was there, Dana Chen, Bob Henderson, at least a dozen others who live on or adjacent to this street. You're welcome to speak with any of them. Decker wrote something. "You have any history with the Bexley family prior to tonight?" "Yes." Grant walked them through it. The driveway confrontation in June, the property damage, the police report he'd already filed, Harriet Bloom's letter to Gerald Fitch, the visit to Sophie's workplace, the appearance on his porch. He delivered it chronologically, without editorial, the way he'd been trained to brief. Facts, sequence, relevance. Price had stopped pretending to take notes and was just listening. When Grant finished, Decker looked at his notepad for a moment. "You filed a property damage report on June 23rd? "Yes, report number is on my phone. I can give you that." "That'd be helpful." Sophie came downstairs while Grant was looking up the report number. She'd clearly been awake. She was still in the sundress, hadn't changed, and she stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the 2 officers with the careful composure of someone who'd been listening from the top landing and had decided that coming down was better than not. "Sophie," Grant said, "you don't need to be here." "I know," she said, and stayed where she was. Decker looked at her. "You were at the cookout this evening, miss?" "Yes." "Did you witness the altercation?" "I witnessed the whole thing," she said. Bryce came in with gloves on. He called my dad out in front of everyone. My dad said yes, but only if Bryce agreed to stop harassing our family. She paused. Bryce agreed. Then he threw the first punch. My dad didn't hit him once. He put him on the ground and held him there until Bryce said done. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without flinching, Carla's daughter. Then my dad got up and got his drink, and that was it. The two officers exchanged a glance that wasn't quite a look, but was adjacent to one. Thank you, Decker said. Also, Sophie added, I can tell you his car's been parked half on our sidewalk for 2 months, if you want to add that to whatever you're writing down. Grant looked at her. She met his eyes for a half second, a flicker of something that might have been the ghost of a smile, and then looked back at Officer Decker with complete seriousness. Decker wrote something down, though Grant suspected it wasn't about the parking. Musm. The officers left at 10:23. They didn't say much on their way out. Decker said they'd be speaking with other witnesses and that someone would follow up, and he said it in a tone that made clear the follow-up was likely to be directed elsewhere. Price, at the door, looked at Grant with an expression that had something human in it, a small acknowledgement that wasn't anything official, and then they were gone. Grant locked the door and stood in the hallway. You okay? Sophie asked from the stairs. I'm fine. You should sleep. You should sleep. Sophie, I'm just saying. She came down the last 2 steps and stood in the hallway and looked at him with the particular direct attention she'd had since she was small, like she was taking inventory, checking something against a list she kept internally. Are they going to arrest you? No. You're sure? I'm sure. She nodded, working through something. He threw the first punch, Dad. Like, that's a fact. Half the neighborhood saw it. I know. So they can't do anything. They can't do anything. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, Your ribs. When he hit you with that body shot, are they okay? He hadn't mentioned the ribs. He hadn't reacted when it happened. He looked at her. You saw that? I saw everything. A pause. I noticed things. You taught me to notice things. He had, actually. He'd made it a kind of game when she was younger. Who can spot what's different? Who sees it first? She'd gotten good at it. He'd been pleased by that and occasionally inconvenienced by it, usually in situations exactly like this one. They're fine, he said. Bruised, maybe. Nothing bad. She accepted this. She went back upstairs. He heard her door close and then, a minute later, the small sounds of her settling. Bed springs, the fan she kept in her room, the particular acoustic signature of the house at night that he'd memorized without intending to. He sat down on the couch and put his head back and stared at the ceiling. His ribs hurt. His hip hurt where Bryce's kick had connected. He was 38 years old and he'd handled it fine. Everything had gone the way his experience said it would, and he still felt the specific kind of tired that comes not from physical exertion, but from the sustained effort of managing a situation without losing yourself in it. He thought about Bryce's face when he'd said done, the way the word had come out, tight, almost inaudible, a sound forced out of a person who'd never been in a position that required it. He didn't feel good about it. He hadn't expected to. There was nothing satisfying about physically dominating a 19-year-old in a backyard, even one who'd spent months making his daughter's life smaller. The satisfaction people expected in these moments, the clean cinematic closure, wasn't something he'd experienced in a long time. Maybe not ever. Things ended and you moved on and carried them a little, and that was the reality of it. What he felt was something closer to tired relief, like a gear that had been grinding finally hit the right position. Not good, just correctly aligned. For now. He checked his phone. No calls. He sent Harriet Bloom a text summarizing the police visit, knowing she'd see it in the morning. He sent Marcus a single line. Situation developed tonight. Call tomorrow. Then he turned out the downstairs lights and went to bed and slept 6 hours without interruption, which was better than most nights had been lately. But Bambison's Bussy saw. What Grant didn't know, what nobody on Birchwood Lane knew yet, was that the cookout had been recorded. The footage wasn't from a security camera or a Ring doorbell. It came from a kid named Jordan Park, who was 15 and had come to the cookout with his parents, and had started filming on his phone when Bryce walked in with the gloves because something about it felt like content, the raw, immediate instinct of his generation to document things that seemed like they were about to become something. Jordan had filmed the whole thing, 4 minutes and 22 seconds, starting from Bryce's entrance through the gate and ending about 30 seconds after Bryce walked off the property. He'd filmed with his phone angled down slightly, the way teenagers film things when they're not entirely sure they should be filming, trying to be inconspicuous. The footage was slightly shaky and the audio had the hollow quality of outdoor phone recording, but it was clear. Every word Bryce said in his opening challenge was audible. The first punch was on camera. Grant's non-response to it was on camera. The takedown was on camera. Bryce saying "done" into the grass was on camera. Jordan had not posted it that night. He'd shown it to his older sister, who told him to be careful, and then he'd gone to sleep thinking about it. And in the morning, Saturday morning, the day after, he'd woken up to 3 texts from friends who'd been at the cookout asking if he'd filmed anything. He showed them. The clip spread through the local teenager network by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, someone had sent it to Carol Ramsey. By 3, Carol had called Phil Garza. By 4, Phil was standing on Grant's front porch holding his phone. "You need to see this," Phil said. Grant watched it standing in his own doorway. He watched it twice. The second time he watched Bryce's face in the seconds before the first punch. The calculation there, the performance of it, the awareness of the audience. He watched his own face, which was harder to look at, the specific flatness of his expression that he knew people sometimes found unnerving. He handed the phone back. "Jordan Park filmed it," Phil said. "The kid. He's been sitting on it, but his friends got it, and now it's going around." "How far?" "Locally far as I know, but you know how that goes." Grant thought for a moment. "How are people reacting?" Phil gave him a look. "Grant, you held a guy on the ground without hitting him. You're not the bad guy in the video." "That's not what I'm worried about." "I know what you're worried about." Phil put his phone in his pocket. "Warren is going to see this. He may have already. What does that mean for you?" Grant looked past Phil at the street. A Saturday afternoon, quiet, a kid on a bike going past, the Bexley driveway empty for once because the G-Wagon was gone, which meant Warren was somewhere doing something and had been since at least this morning. "It means the complaint to the police is going to fall apart very quickly," Grant said. 50 witnesses plus video. That's not a case. That's a liability." Phil nodded slowly. "And beyond that?" Grant didn't answer that part, because the beyond that was the piece he was still working through, had been working through since he'd sat on his couch at 10:30 the night before staring at the ceiling. "Thanks for telling me," he said. "You want me to talk to Jordan? His parents?" "No, let it go where it goes naturally." He thought about this. "Actually, if the Parks are comfortable with it, I'd like a copy of the original file, full resolution, just to have." Phil said he'd ask. He left. Grant went inside. He called Harriet Bloom, who picked up on the second ring despite it being a Saturday, which was one of the reasons she was expensive. "Video footage," he told her. 4 minutes, start to finish, clear audio." A brief pause. "Where?" "Circulating among neighbors, started with a teenager who was at the event." "Has it gone beyond local?" "Not yet." "Okay." He could hear her thinking. "We don't push it. We don't share it. We don't post it. We don't reference it in any communications. It exists. That's enough. If the Bexleys pursue the police complaint, we reference that footage exists and is available. That'll end the complaint." "That's my read too." "Grant." Her voice shifted slightly, the professional register dropping by a fraction. "I've had 3 cases involving Warren Bexley's attorney, Gerald Fitch. He's competent, but he's careful. When Fitch sees that footage, he's going to tell Warren exactly what it means, which is that the assault complaint is not going to court, and pursuing it will make things significantly worse." A pause. "The question is what Warren does when he's out of legal options." "He has other options," Grant said. "Business ones." "Yes." "How exposed are you?" "Less than he thinks." He said it carefully. "There's also a question of how exposed he is." Harriet was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the particular careful quality of an attorney who wants to understand something without asking it directly. "Is there anything I should be aware of?" "Not yet," he said. "I'll let you know." The police made 3 additional visits to neighbors that Saturday. Decker and Price, working through the afternoon, spoke with Phil Garza, Dana Chen, Bob Henderson, and Carol Ramsey. Grant knew this because Phil texted him updates in real time, the running commentary of a man who was invested in this and felt helpfully positioned as a communications relay. Dana told them everything, the parking lot thing, the porch visit, all of it. She was very thorough. I think Decker might be a little in love with her. Bob showed them the police report number you gave him from the property damage filing. He'd written it down, apparently. Carol Ramsey told them Bryce walked in with the gloves on. She specifically said, he came prepared to do something. Carol is 71, and she used the phrase premeditated confrontation. She watches a lot of true crime. The final text came at 4:47. Officers went next door. Warren met them at the door. Not sure what happened inside. Then, at 6:12, just heard from Bob. Decker apparently told Warren there was insufficient evidence to support an assault charge and that based on witness accounts, the contact was mutually agreed upon and initiated by his son. Warren apparently lost his mind a little. Bob heard it from the driveway. Grant read this, set his phone down, and went to the kitchen to start dinner. Sophie came down at 6:30, showered, in different clothes, and sat at the kitchen table without being asked. "Phil's been texting you every 20 minutes, she said. "Yes." "What's he saying?" Grant told her the outline. She listened, picking at a loose thread on the hem of her shirt, the particular restless attention of someone trying to seem casual about something they're actually very focused on. "So the police aren't going to do anything to you," she said. "No." "But Warren's angry." "Warren is very angry." She pulled the thread. It came loose in her hand and she looked at it. "What does he do when he's angry and he can't sue you?" Grant put a pan on the stove. "He tries something else." "That's not comforting." "I know, but it's honest." She looked up at him. "You know something I don't." It wasn't a question. He'd raised her too honestly for her to miss the thing behind what he'd said, the quality of someone who knows the shape of the next move before it arrives. "Some things," he said. She considered this with the particular patience of a kid who'd grown up with a father who didn't explain everything immediately, but had never, in 16 years, given her a real reason not to trust the process. "Okay," she said. "What are we having?" "Pasta." "Do we have that garlic bread, the frozen kind?" "There's one left." "Great." She pulled out her phone. "I'm putting it in now so I don't forget." He let her do it. She got up and went to the freezer and he listened to the comfortable, ordinary sounds of it. The freezer opening, the oven beeping as it preheated, Sophie saying it says 400 degrees like she hadn't read the same box 40 times. And he thought about how small and necessary these moments were. How easy they were to take for granted until something made them feel contingent. Nothing had happened to them. Not really. A bad neighbor, a stupid son, some property damage, a bruised hip, 2 police visits. In the context of things that could happen to people, it was minor. He knew that. He'd been in places where the stakes were not minor, and the memory of those places gave him perspective he didn't always know what to do with. But Sophie was 16, and this was her street, and her sense of safety in her own home had been quietly eroded over 8 weeks by a man who thought his money gave him the right to reach into other people's lives. That was the thing Grant hadn't been able to let go of, through all of it. Not the truck, not the lawsuit threat, not the punch at the cookout. The thing he kept coming back to was Sophie saying, "I'm really tired" in the car, and the way she'd stopped letting Lily walk home with her because she didn't want Lily around when something happened. 16, just wanting to be tired about something else. Sunday passed quietly. Monday arrived, and with it Marcus. Not a call this time. Marcus drove up from the D.C. area, appeared at Grant's door at 10 in the morning with 2 coffees from somewhere decent, which meant he'd left early. He was 6'2", lean, with the specific economy of movement that stayed with people long after they'd left the teams. He and Grant had served together for 8 years. There wasn't a version of any of this that Marcus didn't have context for. They sat in the backyard. Sophie was at work. Marcus put his coffee down and said, I did more digging on the Bexley contract. And the compliance flag I mentioned, the unresolved one in the Ferris-Dalton procurement record. I had a former colleague look at it, someone currently in federal acquisition oversight. He paused. It's not minor. The subcontract with Bexley Commercial was structured in a way that routes through a holding company that Warren has a direct financial interest in. There's a disclosure requirement for that kind of arrangement. The disclosure was not made at contract award. Grant looked at his coffee. That's a conflict of interest issue. A significant one. Ferris-Dalton may not have known. Their acquisition team may have been sloppy rather than intentional, but Warren knew. He structured it specifically to obscure the connection. Marcus's voice was even. If this goes to the contracting officer, Ferris-Dalton loses the contract. Warren's company loses the subcontract, $42 million, approximately, over the remaining contract term. The yard was quiet. A neighbor's sprinkler was running somewhere nearby, the irregular tick of it carrying over the fence. How did this not get flagged before? Grant asked. It probably should have. Someone was either not paying attention or was trusting the contractor to self-disclose, which they didn't. He picked up his coffee. This isn't my doing, Grant. I want to be clear. I found it. My contact confirmed it exists. What happens with it is a separate thing. I know. I'm not suggesting you use it. I know that too. Marcus looked at him. What are you thinking? Grant thought about Warren on his porch. I know judges. And Warren at the cookout, the linen blazer and the wine bottle, and the particular ease of a man who'd operated without friction for so long that friction no longer felt like something that could actually stop him. He thought about Gerald Fitch's voicemail, smooth and measured. He thought about Bryce at the garden center, at Sophie's porch, at the cookout in his gloves. He thought about something Harriet had said. The goal is pressure. I'm not going to file anything, he said. I'm not going to call anyone. I'm not going to do anything with this information. Marcus waited. But Warren is going to make calls, Grant continued. He told me at the cookout that he'd been asking about my employer. He told me back in June that he knew people, that he'd make calls and cause problems. He picked up his coffee. If he makes those calls to federal contracting officials, to oversight bodies, to anyone in the acquisition system about Halcyon or about me personally, then the people he's calling are going to be exactly the people who should know what's in that procurement record. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, So you're not doing anything? I'm not doing anything. You're just aware of something that exists. Exactly. Another pause. Marcus looked at his coffee cup. That's a very elegant non-plan. I didn't go looking for it. You asked me to look into his business interests. I asked you to look. You looked. You found something that exists independently of anything I do or don't do. Marcus sat with this for a while. Out in the yard, a bird landed on the old swing set, one of the small brown ones that Grant never remembered the name of, and sat there a moment, then left. He's going to make the calls, Marcus said finally. Yes, he will. He can't help it. It's who he is. It's who he is, Grant agreed. Marcus picked up his coffee and leaned back in his chair and looked up at the sky. You know what I always thought about you in the teams? Grant waited. You were the one who never wasted movement, Marcus said. Other guys, good guys, serious guys, they'd do more than they needed to. More force, more prep, more coverage. You always did exactly what was required and nothing extra. I used to think it was training. Then I thought it was just how you were built. He paused. It's still the same. Grant didn't answer that. He drank his coffee. They sat in the backyard for another hour, talking about the company, about a contract renewal coming up in October, about Marcus's daughter who'd just started college in North Carolina and was already calling twice a week, about the Eagles' secondary because that was apparently a subject Grant was having conversations about constantly now. Normal things. The scaffolding of a regular life held in place by the kind of friendship that doesn't require explanation. When Marcus left at noon, Grant walked him to his car and shook his hand and said, "Thank you." Marcus shrugged one shoulder. "What are you thanking me for? I didn't do anything." "I know," Grant said. "That's what I'm thanking you for." Marcus drove off, and Grant stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the Monday noon heat, looking at the Bexley house. The G-Wagon was in the driveway. Warren was home. Grant went inside. He had a proposal to review, a call at 2 with a client in Virginia, Sophie's car insurance renewal to deal with, and a frozen lasagna in the freezer that was approaching its use-by date and needed to become dinner at some point. He did all of those things. He did them in order, with his full attention on each one. The call ran long because the client had questions, and Grant answered them precisely. At 4:15, his phone rang, a Washington number he didn't recognize. He answered it. A man's voice, official, identifying himself as working in federal contract compliance with the General Services Administration. He said he'd received a contact from a Warren Bexley, who had made allegations concerning a company called Halcyon Security Solutions and an individual named Grant Holloway, and was looking to discuss those allegations. Of course, Grant said. He kept his voice level and professional. I'm happy to cooperate fully. I should mention, while we're establishing context, that we hold all required certifications, our compliance documentation is current, and I'd welcome any review of our contracting record. I can have our documentation to you within 24 hours. A brief pause on the line. I should also mention, Grant continued carefully, that in the course of my own due diligence regarding Mr. Bexley, I became aware of some potentially relevant information regarding a procurement matter involving Bexley Commercial Properties and the Ferris-Dalton contract at the Baltimore facility. I'm not certain of the details, but I'd want to make sure, if there's any review underway, that all relevant parties have whatever information exists. I can put you in touch with the appropriate person if that would be helpful. Another pause. Longer this time. That would be very helpful, the voice said. Grant gave him Marcus's former colleague's name, which Marcus had provided for exactly this contingency. He did it calmly and without relish, and without any particular tone about it. Just a citizen, being cooperative. He hung up. He sat at his desk for a moment. Then he opened the lasagna instructions on his phone because he could never remember what temperature it needed, and he had 2 hours before Sophie got home from work. And dinner didn't make itself. The lasagna needed 400 degrees and 45 minutes covered, then 15 uncovered. Grant had gotten it wrong once before, pulled it out too early, the center still cold, and Sophie had eaten it without complaint, but he'd noticed her pushing the middle section to the edge of her plate. He set a timer this time. He was careful about small things when larger things were in motion, because the small things were the ones you could actually control. Sophie came home at 6, smelling like soil and fertilizer, bike helmet under her arm, and she dropped her bag in the hallway and said, "Something smells good," in the automatic way she said it when she was tired and her defenses were down and she wasn't editing herself. "Lasagna," he said. 20 minutes. She went upstairs to shower. He set the table, which was something he did maybe 3 times a week, and ate standing at the counter the rest of the time. But tonight felt like a sit-down night without him being able to articulate exactly why. They ate, and Sophie talked about the garden center. A woman who'd come in wanting a plant that would survive in a north-facing bathroom with no natural light, and how Sophie had spent 20 minutes researching it and eventually recommended a cast-iron plant, which she found genuinely satisfying. She talked about it the way she talked about things she was actually interested in, not the careful edited version she sometimes produced when she was managing his feelings about how she was doing. He listened. He asked about the woman, about whether she'd bought it, about what else grew in no-light conditions. He was genuinely curious, or at least genuinely interested in Sophie being curious, which was close enough. He didn't tell her about the phone call, not because he was hiding it, but because there was nothing yet to tell, not in any form that would resolve anything, and Sophie had enough to carry without updates that were incomplete. He washed the dishes afterward and she dried, a division they'd fallen into years ago without discussing it, and the kitchen was quiet and ordinary, and he let himself be in it without making it mean anything beyond what it was. The call from the GSE compliance officer was followed, over the next 2 weeks, by silence of a very specific kind. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of things happening somewhere he couldn't see, in offices and through channels that moved slowly and without announcement. Harriet Bloom called him on a Thursday to say that Gerald Fitch had sent a formal letter withdrawing all potential claims against Grant Holloway, citing insufficient basis for legal action and mutually agreed upon physical engagement. The language was so careful it was almost funny. Gerald Fitch's way of backing down without technically appearing to move. "Is it over?" Sophie asked when Grant told her, sitting across the kitchen table with her homework spread out around her, a pen in her hand. "That part is?" She looked at him steadily. "What part isn't?" He told her about Warren's call to the GSA, not the compliance issue that was still moving through channels and wasn't resolved and wasn't something he wanted her sitting with, but the part where Warren had tried to make a problem for Halcyon and the part where it hadn't worked. Sophie put her pen down. "He called the government about you." "Yes." "And?" "Our documentation is current. Our record is clean. There's nothing there." She absorbed this. "So he lost." "He hasn't won anything." "Same thing." "Not quite." He paused. "Warren has his own problems now, his own compliance issues. That process will take some time, but it's moving." She looked at him for a long moment. "Did you do that?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "I made a phone call," he said. "I provided information that was accurate and relevant and already existed. I didn't create anything. I didn't file anything. I told a compliance officer that certain information was available, and he found it." Sophie sat with this. He watched her work through it. The part of her that was young enough to want things to be simple and clean, and the part of her that was old enough to understand they rarely were. "Is that the right thing?" she asked. It was a real question, not a test, not an accusation, just a real question from a 16-year-old who was paying attention. "I think so," he said. "He built something real and hid it behind paperwork. That paperwork was going to stay hidden until he pointed someone in the right direction, which he did himself by making that call. What happened after is just what happens when real things get looked at. You knew he'd make the call." "I thought he probably would." "Because he can't help it." Grant looked at his daughter. "Because men who've never had to stop usually don't know how," he said. Sophie picked up her pen and looked at her homework. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, without looking up, "That's kind of sad." "Yeah," he said. "A little bit." Tick. Jordan Park's video did not stay local. It spread the way things spread now. Through the teenager network first, then to parents who'd seen it from their kids' phones and found it unexpectedly compelling, then to one of those local Facebook groups where neighborhood news migrated and mutated. Someone posted it with a caption that was slightly misleading. Someone else corrected it. The correction got more engagement than the original post, and by the end of the first week in August, the video had roughly 40,000 views from sources outside Birchwood Lane. Grant didn't follow it. Phil Garza followed it and provided updates because Phil had the particular combination of free time and social media literacy that made him a reliable narrator of these things. "The comments are mostly good," Phil said from his usual position beside Grant's grill on a Sunday evening. "Some people are saying you're a trained fighter, so it's unfair. Most people are saying the kid threw the first punch, so it doesn't matter." "Phil?" "There's a whole thread debating whether the takedown was BJJ or judo. The BJJ people and the judo people are fighting about it." "Phil?" "I'm just saying it's interesting." "It's not interesting to me." Phil drank his beer. "Fair enough." A pause. "There's also a few people who identified Bryce, found his social media, found out where he trains. Some martial arts forums got the video." Grant looked at him. "How bad?" "I mean, his coach saw it, the gym saw it." Phil shrugged. "From what I understand, the gym has a conduct policy, something about representing the school outside training. They take that seriously." Grant was quiet for a moment. He hadn't anticipated that specific development. He hadn't wanted it either. Not because Bryce didn't deserve consequences, but because there was something uncomfortable about consequences that came through public exposure rather than any process. It was messier, less clean. But he also hadn't made the video. He hadn't posted it. Jordan Park had filmed it, and the crowd had shared it, and the gym had its own policies and its own obligations, and none of that was Grant's doing. That distinction mattered to him, though he understood it might not matter to Bryce. "What happened?" he asked. "He's out," Phil said. "As of last week. Apparently they also stripped the black belt pending review, something about misrepresenting his record in competition, which was a separate thing the video dug up." Grant nodded once. He didn't say anything about it. He was good, Phil offered. I mean, he's a legitimate martial artist. That's real. The technique was there. Yes, Grant agreed. It was. Phil looked at him. He just picked the wrong guy. He picked a fight he couldn't see clearly, Grant said. That's different from picking the wrong guy. Phil thought about this. What's the difference? The difference is it wasn't really about me. It was about what he thought I was. What he needed me to be. Grant turned the grill over the coals, checking the heat. He couldn't have won against anyone who wasn't what he imagined, because he wasn't fighting a person. He was fighting an idea. Phil was quiet for a moment. That's actually pretty smart. It's also kind of common, Grant said, more than people think. The GSA compliance review concluded in the second week of September. Grant knew it was close when Harriet Bloom called him on a Tuesday morning with a particular efficiency in her voice that meant something concrete had happened. The Ferris-Dalton contract, she said. The subcontract with Bexley Commercial has been terminated for cause. Ferris-Dalton received a formal notice of non-compliance. They've been given 60 days to cure, which in practice means they're finding a new subcontractor and distancing from Warren Bexley as fast as they can manage. Grant sat with this for a moment. And Warren? His company's exposure is significant. The subcontract termination creates a default event under some of his commercial lending arrangements, standard cross-default clauses. He's going to have a very difficult fall. A pause. Grant, I want to be careful about how I say this. The outcome was driven entirely by a real compliance failure that predated any of your involvement. You identified that it existed, which any citizen is entitled to do, and the appropriate regulatory authority investigated and acted. There's nothing in your conduct that's legally problematic. I know. I just want to make sure you're comfortable with it. He thought about that for a moment. Comfortable. It was an interesting word for it. He wasn't comfortable, exactly. There was nothing comfortable about watching a structure collapse, even one that deserved to. He hadn't felt satisfaction when Bryce said done in the grass, and he didn't feel satisfaction now. What he felt was something more like the absence of a weight, like setting down something heavy you've been carrying long enough that you forgot you were carrying it. I'm clear on it, he said. That's different from comfortable. Harriet paused. That's probably the right answer. He thanked her and hung up and sat at his desk and looked at the window. September was doing its thing outside, the light going lower and more golden, the leaves on the maple in the front yard starting to turn at the edges. The particular quality of air that meant summer was folding itself up. He thought about Warren. He tried to do it honestly, without the filter of the past months. A man who'd built something real over 22 years, who'd taken shortcuts that seemed fine until they weren't, who'd raised a son in his image and then watched that image fail publicly. That was its own kind of reckoning. Grant didn't need to add anything to it. He thought about Bryce. 19 years old, a legitimate skill set, no framework for losing because nobody had ever given him one. Whatever came next for Bryce was genuinely unknown. People that age were still building who they were going to be, even when they'd built badly so far. That was the thing about 19. It was still early enough to be something other than what you'd been. Grant hoped for that without expecting it. Hoping without expectation was a thing you learned, or you didn't. He didn't see it coming. That was the honest truth. He'd been so focused on the things that were still moving. The compliance review, Harriet's updates, the question of what Warren would do next, that he missed the thing that was happening right in front of him. Sophie started sleeping better in August. He noticed it indirectly at first. She was down earlier, quieter in the mornings, less of that tight watchfulness around her eyes. She started walking to Lily's house again without asking him if it was okay. She stopped checking the front window when she heard cars outside. Then on a Saturday in late September, she came downstairs in the morning and made herself breakfast and sat at the table and said, without looking up from her eggs, I think I want to do volleyball in the spring, like actually try for varsity. He looked up from his coffee. Mrs. Alderman said I have the skill set, but I gave it up sophomore year, and I didn't have a good reason, Sophie continued. I mean, I had a reason. I was tired. But it wasn't a good reason. She finally looked up. I think I've been letting things make me small, like agreeing to be smaller than I am because it seemed easier. Grant set his coffee down. That's a lot of insight for 8 in the morning. I've been thinking about it for a while. She went back to her eggs. Mrs. Alderman runs the tryouts in February. I'm going to start training with Priya in October, so I'm actually ready. He looked at his daughter, at the set of her shoulders, at the matter-of-fact tone, at the way she'd announced it like a decision that had been made and was no longer under discussion. Okay, he said. You're not going to say anything about it? What would I say? She considered. I don't know, something dad-ish? I think it's good, he said. I think you should do it. She nodded, satisfied, and finished her eggs. She rinsed her plate, put it in the dishwasher, and went back upstairs to do whatever she'd planned to do with her Saturday. Grant sat alone at the kitchen table with his coffee going warm in his hands and the house quiet around him, and the maple outside doing its September thing in the morning light. He'd had conversations with her over the years that he'd known were important while they were happening. The ones about her mother, the first ones after Carla died when Sophie was 4, and asking questions he didn't know how to answer right. The ones about moving here, about his work, about the things he couldn't tell her in full, and how to be honest about that without being absent. He'd had conversations that cost him something, that required him to be more present than felt natural. That conversation about volleyball hadn't cost him anything. It hadn't been hard or important feeling. It had been completely ordinary. And somehow, that was the one that stayed with him all morning. 1. The Bexleys were gone by October. Not suddenly. It happened the way these things happen in real life, gradually and then all at once. The contractor stopped coming. The G-Wagon was in the driveway less often. Phil Garza reported, without being asked, that he'd seen a real estate agent at the house on 2 separate occasions. Then a sign went up, the discreet kind that high-end listings used, just a small placard near the mailbox. Grant saw Warren once in the final weeks. It was a Tuesday morning, early, and Warren was loading something into the back of his car. Boxes, a garment bag, the particular collection of things a man grabs when he's not quite moving out, but beginning the process of it. He was in a jacket and slacks, dressed for somewhere he had to be, and he looked like a person who'd lost weight without intending to. He saw Grant. They were 20 feet apart across the property line, the same 20 feet that had been contested ground for 4 months. Warren looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing readable in it, not anger, not concession, just the flat, unreadable expression of a man who'd run out of the energy required to perform his own feelings. Grant held his eyes and nodded. Once. Not a greeting exactly. Something closer to acknowledgement, which was different. Warren didn't nod back. He closed the trunk and got in the car and drove away. That was the last time Grant saw him. The house sold in November. A young family, 2 parents, 3 kids, a dog that immediately started using the bird bath as a water dish, which Carol Ramsey found charming. Their name was Okafor. The father was a high school science teacher. The mother was a nurse. They introduced themselves on a Saturday morning, and the mother brought over a plate of chin-chin, a Nigerian fried snack that Sophie ate enthusiastically and immediately looked up how to make. They were good neighbors. They were the kind of people who waved when they saw you and meant it. It's it. Grant didn't think about it often, the whole arc of it, from the moving truck in April to the for sale sign in October. It wasn't the kind of thing he revisited much, because revisiting wasn't his way. He processed things in real time and then filed them in the part of his mind where things were kept but not frequently opened. But sometimes, in the particular quiet of late evenings when Sophie was upstairs and the house had settled into its night sounds, he would sit in the kitchen with something to drink and let himself think about what it had actually been. It had been, at its core, a simple thing dressed up in complexity. A man with power had assumed that power meant he couldn't be stopped. His son had grown up watching that assumption go unchallenged and had internalized it as a truth about the world. And then they'd come up against someone who didn't respond the way the assumption required, and the whole structure had turned out to be less solid than it looked. Grant had not won anything, not in any traditional sense. He hadn't fought for status or pride or the satisfaction of being right. He'd fought, in the only ways that actually mattered, for Sophie's ability to walk to her job and have her friends over and try out for the volleyball team in February without calculating the cost of it. That was it. That was the whole thing. He thought sometimes about the question Sophie had asked him at the kitchen table, "Is that the right thing?" and about how he'd answered it and whether the answer held up under examination. He still thought it did, but he also knew that doing the right thing and doing a clean thing weren't always identical, and that living honestly meant sitting with that gap rather than talking your way out of it. He hadn't been particularly noble. He'd been careful and patient, and he'd used what he knew because he had it, and it was relevant. Those things weren't the same as nobility. They were just competence, applied consistently over time. Phil Garza, who had a talent for reducing things to their usable elements, had said it best on the last night of summer, standing at Grant's grill with a beer in his hand and the street going quiet around them. "You know what I kept thinking?" Phil said. "The whole time, from the beginning. What I kept thinking was that he never actually saw you." Grant had looked at him. "Warren, Bryce, they looked at you and they saw what they wanted to see, a quiet guy with a nothing job who wouldn't push back." Phil drank. They never once wondered why a man that capable was being so careful. Grant had thought about that afterward, about the specific nature of being unseen, how it was sometimes a disadvantage and sometimes the most significant advantage available to you. He'd chosen quiet for reasons that were real. Because Sophie needed stability, because he'd had enough years of operating at full volume and found the silence afterward valuable in ways he hadn't expected. Because the person he'd been in those 14 years didn't need to announce himself to remain who he was. And that was the thing Bryce had mistaken most fundamentally. He'd read Grant's restraint as the absence of something, as a gap, as weakness in the original Latin sense, a place that would give way under pressure. What it actually was a choice, made every day, deliberately, because the people worth protecting deserved the version of him that came home at dinner time and helped with homework and coached volleyball when the regular coach was sick. Not the other version. Not the one with the clearances and the history and the particular set of skills that still lived in his muscle memory, like a language he'd been raised speaking. He didn't need anyone to know about that version. He'd never needed it. And the fact that Bryce and Warren had walked into his life and required him to demonstrate it, briefly, in a suburban backyard on a hot July evening, that was their failure of imagination, not his. Sophie made varsity in February. Not easily. The tryout was hard and she came home the first day with sore shoulders and a face that said it was harder than she'd expected. She came home the second day quieter, the face of someone recalibrating. She came home the third day and said she thought she'd gotten it and didn't want to talk about it until she knew. She got it. She told him by text because she found out during school and couldn't wait. A single message, just varsity. Don't make a big deal. He read it at his desk, in the middle of a conference call, and said nothing and showed nothing because he was on camera. When the call ended, he sat for a moment and let himself feel it in the privacy of his own office. Then he texted back, "Congrats. Dinner wherever you want." She chose the Mexican place on Route 30 that he found too loud, and she found exactly right. They sat in a booth and she talked about the team and the coach and which girls she already knew, and one girl named Destiny who was apparently extremely fast, and Sophie was very interested in what that would mean for their dynamic. She talked through most of the meal and he asked questions and the restaurant was loud and the chips were too salty, and it was exactly right. Walking to the car afterward, Sophie put her arm through his the way she'd done when she was small. Not a hug exactly, just contact, the particular weight of someone choosing to be close to you without making it a production. "Thanks," she said. "For what?" "I don't know." She leaned slightly into his shoulder as they walked. "Just for not making it worse when it was bad, and for making it better when you could." He didn't say anything for a moment. The parking lot was lit by those yellow-orange lights that made everything look like a memory. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm was going off and stopping and going off again. "I didn't always know what I was doing," he said. "I know." A pause. "But you kept doing it anyway. That's the part that counts." He unlocked the car. They got in. He backed out of the parking space carefully because the lot was tight and there was a minivan at an odd angle, and Sophie put her feet on the dashboard and connected her phone to the aux cord and found something she wanted to hear. The music started. He pulled onto Route 30 and headed home. The street they turned onto was quiet at 10 on a February night, the cold, clear kind of quiet that came with winter here, the old trees bare and the porch lights on, and the houses holding their light inside. He drove past the Okafor house, lit up, the sound of the TV barely audible as he slowed for the turn, and pulled into his own driveway and put the car in park. Sophie was already gathering her bag, already moving. She got out and walked up the front steps and let herself in without needing him to unlock it, the practiced ease of someone in her own home. He sat in the car for a moment. Birchwood Lane was quiet. It was just a street, houses and lawns and a bird bath that had ice in it in February and brown sparrows in it in summer, people who waved and meant it. Phil Garza 3 houses down. Dana Chen's daughters, who weren't allowed outside alone anymore, but were again now, and had been for months. It wasn't a grand place. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came after something significant. It was just the ordinary quiet of an ordinary street at 10 at night, carrying the weight of nothing in particular. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. He got out of the car and locked it, and walked up the front steps and went inside where it was warm, and the door closed behind him, and the street stayed quiet.